I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to the report provided by the Ontario Government on their continuous use of emergency powers over the last 8.5 months. This is an unprecedented discussion we are having here today, and there is a lot to discuss, and a lot that concerns me in this report and concerns many across Ontario. I'm concerned about the precedent that we, as elected public servants representing the voters, have and continue to set on our future generations, on how our democracy operates and what our government can and cannot do. For 232 consecutive days since March 17, 2020, the executive branch of this Ontario government has had the ability to apply emergency powers on Ontario citizens without justification. For more than 100 consecutive days, the executive branch of our Ontario government has had this emergency power without having to come back to this House for a debate or vote on this issue. A truly unprecedented overreach of government, a power grab that we have never seen before in the 153-year history of this legislature. This government initially told us that the use of emergency powers was necessary for a couple of weeks, just to make sure our healthcare system wasn't overwhelmed. 2 weeks turned to 4, then 8, then 16. We are soon going to approach a full calendar year of this government exercising emergency powers on Ontario residents based on decisions made behind closed doors without having to bring these decisions here in this legislature to present, debate, defend, and vote. When Bill 195 was originally presented, we were told that in exchange for having the right to debate, discuss, and vote on the use of emergency powers in this legislature and at committee, the government would be providing us with a report that we could see and talk about. That report was provided to us this week, entitled The Report on Ontario's Provincial Emergency. And I hate to say it, but it is a sad and sorry replacement for government subjecting itself to scrutiny for applying powers that have traditionally been required to be discussed in this legislature. Their report does not provide much of anything that isn't already out there. It is less of a report and more like a consolidation. A real report would have included data that the government used in its decision-making, the results of the impact in terms of COVID-19 cases, in terms of fatalities, in terms of the impact on our economy and our healthcare system. This report provides none of that. This is what I feared when I was faced with the choice to vote for or against Bill 195, and when I was faced with the choice of whether or not I vote in favour of handing over my right to vote as a member of provincial parliament to this government for the next year on their unprecedented use of emergency powers. I feared that the decisions were going to be made in secret, without providing the public or this legislature without enough rationale. And more importantly, I feared the decisions could possibly be made on a whim, without much thought or consideration to the consequences. And therein lies the real poisonous impact of the use of emergency powers by the executive branch of government for such an extended time. Mr. Speaker, it isn't about right or left politics, or being right or wrong. It's about whether or not we believe that government having to debate, discuss, and defend its ideas and decisions, whether that scrutiny that this legislature is supposed to provide, does that result in better or worse policy making? Or at the very least, does the scrutiny make it possible for the government to consider unintended consequences that may arise in decisions they may make on a whim? That is the key behind what we are discussing. Unfortunately, the tribal nature of right and left politics has us not wanting to listen to other opinions or other points of view. And what does that get us? By insulating itself from scrutiny on its decisions, this government has shown that policymaking is worse off and policy setting does not improve. Drastic regulatory orders that micromanage people's lives should not be permitted to be made swiftly in a closed-door meeting without scrutiny. And some would say some of those decisions should not be made at all by government, ever. That is what rights and freedoms are supposed to be about. With Bill 195 and this government's use of emergency powers, we have turned this concept on its head. Now the executive branch of government gets to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, right across Ontario without scrutiny. Let's look at some examples of how this government's decision-making has left people worse off in Ontario because they refuse to listen to other points of view, refuse to be transparent, and refuse to face any scrutiny. I start by looking at some of the concerning language used in the report that shows the perspective and philosophy taken by this government in handling COVID-19. In this report, the government defends shutting down businesses across Ontario, different types of businesses, based on what the government deemed at various times to be essential. No definition of essential is ever provided. So on the one hand, the government believes everything it can do to micromanage people's lives and the rights and liberties they interfere with, those are all essential. On the other hand, they believe that some jobs are essential and others are not. But to the person losing their job, every job is essential. Let's look at how quickly the government decided one service was essential when another was not. Regulation 128/20 decided to allow for curbside pickup of cannabis on April 7, 2020, at a time when all places of worship were still closed and most businesses were not open. That was a government decision, that cannabis be deemed essential while other services were not. Second, throughout this report, the government uses the word reasonable measure to defend its powers, but we are not provided with the other options the government had to consider. Without the other options, there is no way for us to consider whether certain actions were reasonable or not. The report provides little detail on whether or not measures were effective or not. We are not provided with specific data showing where COVID-19 cases were spreading and where they were not. We are not provided with the data to tell us whether restrictions imposed on people's liberties are working. This report does not provide the public with transparency on government decisions or the data. I'm left to think that the reason is because the government doesn't have the rationale or the data, because the government is flying blind. All we know is that province-wide shutdowns have been implemented on different services in the public and private sector, and we know that months later, COVID cases began to increase again with the introduction of the flu season and back to school. The lack of transparency, coupled with the fact that to any Ontarian, it looks like this use of emergency powers is not getting rid of COVID-19, would make it easy for anyone to wonder whether these measures work to stop the spread or whether their purpose was for some other reason. Because if the purpose of these measures was primarily to not overwhelm our healthcare system, we should just say that. And then the discussion should be, how do we fix the healthcare system? Because continuing to shut down sectors of our economy is going to overwhelm our healthcare system in another way, with a lack of funding in the long term. And there are other orders summarized in this report that also provide unprecedented encroachments on the civil liberties of Ontario residents that have not been subject to sufficient scrutiny because of 195. Take Regulation 114/20. In one executive decision, people had to grant their ID by a provincial offences officer when enforcing orders under the Act, but right in the report it says the common law says a person is not required to give that information unless compelled by the legislature and unless reasonable grounds existed. In one pen stroke, this government crushed those civil liberties in the name of fighting COVID. The justification was that the information was needed to enforce orders. But the obvious question is, when you are micromanaging everyone's lives, isn't it impossible to enforce such orders in a consistent way? These are just some of the examples of government overreach on the rights and civil liberties of Ontario residents in the name of solving a problem they have not specifically defined. Without the necessary goals laid out, without scrutiny of this legislature, we have set a dangerous precedent. And that is why I do not regret for 1 minute voting against 195. Some political types ask me, was it worth fighting on that hill? And I say to them, I'm not quite sure what other hill would be left to fight on. We have put in the hands of the executive branch the ability in one meeting to micromanage people's lives, to dictate an intrusion on privacy, to tell people how many people can come over for Thanksgiving, which businesses will close and where, that children over 2 have to wear a mask, to cancel certain medical treatments, to close and reopen, to set prices, all decisions made without the data to back it up, without a healthy debate and discussion and scrutiny, and all in the name of reducing the spread of COVID-19 that this government isn't even sure it can contain at this point, because it did not push the federal government to act quick enough to contain the virus coming in from the border at the outset. This government acted slowly, the federal government acted slowly, and in response, we have a solution proposed that is a government-imposed massive power grab that has done away with civil liberties and done away with the function of this legislature. These decisions were and continue to be unreasonable. They continue to be made without much thought. They are being made based on public pushback and polling and not on debate of policy options or data. The decisions continue to harm the livelihood of Ontario residents and their health. The cure is increasingly looking worse than the disease. And finally, these measures have set a precedent that puts the democratic system in this province and the function of this legislature, 2 things that we take for granted, at risk. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.